All right, everybody, welcome back to the show. In a shocking twist of fate, the Republican Party have become a bunch of socialists. Yes, that's right. The U.S. federal government now wants to take a 10% stake in Intel, one of the biggest tech companies in the world, and are looking to do the exact same thing with Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and a bunch of other military contractors. I don't think this is for ideological reasons. I think that they, number one, want to please their donors, and number two, are looking to increase state power. So we'll get into all of that and more right here on the Quest for Clarity podcast.
Americanism, not globalism.
I am not a slave. I am a free citizen.
There should be no Federal Reserve system.
Only America first.
End all of these wars. America is trying to play empire. We want everything released, and you're actively covering it up. It's not America first to be pushing our influence in areas where it shouldn't be. We're run by people that don't understand what they're doing and don't understand the ramifications of the policies they're enacting. That's an incredibly dangerous situation. All right, before we get into the news, if you could go right down below this video and hit like and subscribe, I'd really appreciate it. Also, if you wouldn't mind going over to Instagram, X, and Spotify and following all my accounts over there, I really would appreciate it. But let's get into the news of the day. So, as I just told you all, just a couple days ago, the U.S. federal government took a 10% ownership stake in Intel, one of the biggest tech companies in the world. As Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, said, who was kind of leading the way in these negotiations, this is what he had to say. Quote, "There's a monstrous discussion about defense. Lockheed Martin makes 97% of their revenue from the U.S. government. They are basically an arm of the U.S. government." So this, of course, was talking about Lockheed Martin, but he had the similar things to say about Intel. Basically, he's switching out subsidies, government subsidies, for ownership in these companies where the subsidies are going. So for those who don't know, government subsidies are basically just taxpayer dollars that are stolen from you and then funneled to private companies, or private public companies, basically contractors that contract for the CIA or the military or the Defense Department. Basically, in some of these big budget bills, portions of money are divided up and given to Boeing or Lockheed Martin or Palantir, or in this case, Intel, in all these different industries that the U.S. government says they have a stake in being successful because it helps America in their world standing for these companies that are U.S. based to be doing well. Now, this is where the term military-industrial complex comes from, but we'll get into that in a little bit later, because right now I just want to focus on this Intel deal, which is, of course, a tech deal. So essentially what they're trying to do here is, in return for the years of subsidies that Intel has been given from the U.S. government, Trump is seeing this in a business sense and thinks that for those subsidies, the U.S. government should get a stake in Intel, in this case, a 10% stake. This is, to anyone who has any concept of economics or socialism, this is 100% by definition socialism. This is just it's not to say that our government is now a socialist government. It is to say that this is an instance of socialist ideology in practice. As I said in the intro to this video, I don't think this was done for ideological reasons. I don't think Donald Trump is ideologically a socialist. I don't think that Howard Lutnick is an ideological socialist. But if you look at what socialism means, that means the government owning the means of production. Then the government owning 10% of one of the biggest tech companies in the world, and as Howard Lutnick said, looking to own chunks of defense contractors, private defense contractors, that is a step towards what the definition of socialism is, the government owning the means of production. So let's get into how this just speaks to the incoherent worldview that seems to be all too common in DC. And the reason it's incoherent is because it is, on the one hand, the Republican Party speaks about capitalism and the evils of socialism, and they all preach and proclaim to be these capitalists. They claim to want to rein back in the government. They claim to want to reduce government involvement in your lives. But on the other hand, they simultaneously enact policies to just interject government into every aspect of private business. As I was talking about, subsidies is the big example of this, the biggest and most prominent example. Government subsidies is where the government taxes you, uses their monopoly on force to force you to pay taxes, which are then taken and funneled to the companies that they see as beneficial to be successful to the United States government. Like I said before, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, all these defense contractors, they receive massive subsidies from the federal government, which that money then goes to produce weapons and planes and all the things that the Defense Department would need to run their cycle of endless war. All of it is connected. The fact that the very fact that the government is propping these companies up is just by definition not capitalism. These companies didn't get, and this is a common argument from actual socialists, is that the military-industrial complex and all these different big companies that get government subsidies are doing so as a result of capitalism. But it's a very important distinction. This is not capitalism. This is crony capitalism, which is a very different thing, where the government is interjecting itself and propping up big companies, which are then pointed to and villainized as villains of capitalism, when it's anything but in reality. Now, and again, this 10% stake in Intel is definitionally socialism. And it comes after years of endless government subsidies, your money being sent to Intel for them to develop technology that's beneficial to the American government. Now, let's just explain why it's bad for the U.S. government to have stakes in these companies, because it's fundamental. It's anyone with a fundamental sense of just incentives, of economics, of capitalism and socialism. It's very easy to understand this. If the government owns 10% of Intel, then the government has an incentive as a part owner of the company to see that that company succeeds on the international stage. That company, they don't want that company to shrink. They only want that company to grow in influence, to grow in profits. And the government slowly goes from governing to being more interested in profits. So how can a government not have a conflict of interest when they own part of one of the biggest companies in the world? Because inevitably, they're going to prioritize at some point the profits of that company. And let's just look at this again from the perspective when it comes to the military-industrial complex. When the government, as Howard Lutnick says, is looking to potentially take ownership stakes in military contractors, do we think that the government that has an ownership stake in those contractors is going to prioritize national interest? Or are they going to prioritize profits for those companies? Meaning, maybe we'll send some weapons to this conflict over in this part of the world, not because it's in our interests, but because, hey, Lockheed Martin and Boeing need some profits for this month. And as part owners of this company, as the federal government is part owners of this company, they need to make some profits as well because they're investors in this company. And investors don't go into investing unless they look to make a return on their investment. So it's all just, as these companies claim, or as the Republican Party claims to be pro-capitalism and anti-government intervention, anti-big government, you can't say that on the one hand and then turn a blind eye to direct government intervention in private industry and the propping up of these big companies, these corrupt companies, to benefit their donors. Because these, you'll notice that these big companies aren't just random companies. These are the companies that donate to Republicans and Democrats. These are the people like Palantir, which is a CIA and defense contracting company. Palantir's owner, Peter Thiel, is J.D. Vance's biggest donor. And now we're in direct conversations about maybe having the federal government take part ownership of Palantir. Does that seem like a conflict of interest? And if you're saying no, you're lying to yourself. Again, it's not America first to be prioritizing the profits of Intel or Boeing or Lockheed Martin or Palantir. America first means that we don't prioritize the profits of defense contracting companies, but we prioritize the national interests of America. It's very simple to see how if the government got entangled in the business dealings of these defense contracting companies that are in the business of producing military technology and military equipment, that suddenly the priority would not be our foreign policy, but instead it would be to make profits for these companies that the government is now a part owner of. So, it's troubling that this is what's going on. And I've been thinking for a long time that Howard Lutnick needs to go, because Howard Lutnick, on the one hand, is just a very unsettling character. He makes me anxious every time he speaks. He's a very weird guy. I don't trust him really, just based on first impressions. I don't trust this guy. I don't know his history. And now he seems to be advocating for the government to expand in power, when traditionally the Republican talking point is that it's going to reduce in power. So this is all just part of an incoherent worldview. It's part of the fact that no one seems to have read a book about anything that's in the government. They don't really have any sort of set worldview at all. And it's just kind of based on wherever the wind blows, it seems like. Now, I do want to also drive home the point that subsidies is really the big issue here. Government subsidies to these private companies was essentially it was before now we're taking ownership of these companies. We were propping them up largely as the big companies. And this is like most prominent in the military industrial complex. Government subsidies is literally the act of the government using their monopoly on force to take your money and then giving that money directly to big companies that are simultaneously, you can see how corrupt this is. Those big companies that are getting government subsidies, that rely on those government subsidies, are the very big companies that donate millions and millions of dollars to these politicians that vote for these subsidies. It's just the most corrupt thing in the world. Tell yourself that these senators and these representatives try and lie to yourself and say that the people who get the donations from these big companies and then vote to subsidize all these big companies with your money, tell yourself right now that those aren't corrupt actors. Go ahead and try to lie to yourself like that. It all just crumbles. It all just falls apart. The whole system is fake. These people who get in there and advocate for foreign policy like we're seeing in Ukraine, the sending of hundreds of billions of dollars at this point to the conflict in Ukraine, the pumping in of military technology into that conflict, the sending of money to Israel, military equipment to Israel. You really think that these senators have a deep ideological tie to Ukraine or Israel? Or is it that they have ties to their donors that fund all of their campaigns, and then once those senators and representatives win, they go ahead and vote for subsidies back to those exact same companies? Do the companies really just support the message of any of these senators that much? Or are they looking for a return on investment? I think it's the latter. I don't think that Boeing, for example, really is inspired by the message of some representative running in like Alabama or something. Do you really think that's the case? Boeing sees that representative's conservative values and is really inspired by that? Or do you think that they're predicting that those guys will just go ahead and vote for a subsidy for Boeing? I think looking at the basic facts of this, the truth is apparent. So I think that's where I'll end it off for today. I guess we're getting big government socialism in a Republican administration, which is a shocking twist. Makes things exciting, of course, in the news. So you never know what could happen. So be sure to follow along here on the show. Be sure to like and subscribe, because you never know what ideological gaps we're gonna be jumping across here. So again, thank you guys so much for watching, and yeah, have a good day.
Americanism, not globalism.
I am not a slave. I am a free citizen.
There should be no Federal Reserve System.
Only America first.